The morning they laughed at Bernard Kowalczyk, 43 people were in the room. He remembered the number exactly because he had counted them afterward, the way a man counts things when he is trying to make sense of something that doesn't fully make sense yet. 43 people in pressed shirts and tailored blazers, standing around a long folding table in the back hall of the Brampton Fairgrounds, and every single one of them had looked at the same thing Bernard had looked at and seen nothing but garbage. He had seen something else. That was the difference. That was the only difference. And it would take 14 months, not 14 days, for the rest of the world to understand what Bernard Kowalczyk had understood in about 40 seconds on a Tuesday morning in November. He had driven down from Collingwood in his truck, the old green F-150, with the cracked side mirror he kept meaning to replace and never did. His son Matthias was in the passenger seat, 16 years old and already at the age where everything his father did was either boring or embarrassing, and an estate auction in Brampton landed firmly in the boring category. "Why do we have to come to this one?" Matthias asked somewhere around Barry. "Because I got a tip," Bernard said. "From who?" "From a man who knows what he's talking about." Matthias put his headphones on. That was the end of that conversation. The tip had come from a retired postal worker named Augustin Prévost, who had spent 32 years delivering mail on a route that included half the old money addresses in Caledon, and who had over those decades developed an eye for things. Augustin called Bernard every few months with something or other. A pine harvest table someone had put out for garbage pickup, a box of silver cutlery at a church sale, a hand-knotted rug rolled up against a fence. Bernard trusted Augustin's instincts the way he trusted his own, which was to say completely, and without needing to explain why to anyone who hadn't earned that trust. What Augustin had told him specifically was this: the Belhaven estate was being liquidated. Howard Belhaven had died in September at 91, a bachelor, no children, no one left who knew what any of his things were or where they had come from. His executor was a nephew in Halifax who had flown in for 3 days, looked around at the house full of antiques and curiosities, and arranged for a general estate auction because it was the fastest way to clear everything out. No specialist appraisers, no catalog. Just pull it all out, put it on tables, and let people bid. "There's a violin," Augustin had said on the phone. "I saw it when they were loading the truck. Brown case, real old, the kind that doesn't have a zipper. The latch is broken. What kind of violin? How would I know what kind of violin? I'm a postman. I'm telling you there's a violin because Howard Belhaven played the violin, and his grandfather played the violin, and his grandfather came from Vienna in 1923 and brought everything he owned on a boat." Bernard had been quiet for a moment. "Vienna," he said. "Vienna," Augustin confirmed. The violin was on a table near the back, between a box of old National Geographics and a set of decorative plates with scenes from the Confederation. The case was exactly as Augustin had described it: brown leather, old, the kind of old that isn't a style but a fact, with a broken latch and a handle worn smooth where a hand had gripped it 10,000 times. Someone had tied a piece of twine around it to keep it shut. Bernard stood in front of it for a long moment without touching it. He was a furniture restorer by trade, had been for 22 years. He refinished and repaired antique pieces out of a shop behind his house, a low-ceilinged building that smelled of linseed oil and wood shavings and the particular dusty warmth of old things being brought back to life. He was not a violin expert. He had never claimed to be a violin expert. But he had spent 2 decades learning how to look at an object and understand what it was telling him, and right now the object in front of him was telling him something. He untied the twine. The case opened stiffly. The lining inside was faded green silk, and the silk was old enough to have developed a particular kind of sheen that cheap fabrics never achieve, a depth that came from age and quality both. The violin in its shaped hollow the way something fits when it was made for exactly that space. There was a bow beside it, the horsehair dark with rosin and age. Bernard picked up the violin. He was not a musician. He could not tell a good instrument from a bad one by playing it, but he could tell wood. He had spent more than 2 decades learning the grammar of wood, how it aged, how it moved, how the grain of it told the story of the tree it had come from and the hands that had shaped it. The wood of this violin was amber dark, the kind of dark that doesn't come from stain but from time, and the grain was so fine it almost disappeared, the kind of grain you only found in wood that had grown very slowly in very cold air. He turned it over. On the back there was a figure-8 shape in the grain where 2 pieces had been joined, a flame pattern, and the flame was so symmetrical it looked almost deliberate, the kind of match cut that old makers selected with enormous care from the same piece of timber. He looked at the varnish, not lacquer. Varnish, real varnish and old varnish, and the way it had aged was not uniform but organic, slightly thicker at the edges where it had been applied last and thinner at the places most touched by hands. He looked inside through the F-holes, tilting the instrument toward the light. There was a label, Every violin had a label. Most of them meant nothing, or meant very little, because for 200 years violin makers had been sticking Stradivarius labels inside instruments that had nothing to do with Stradivarius. It was a kind of tradition, or a kind of fraud, depending on how you looked at it, and by now almost everyone knew that a label alone was worth almost nothing. But this label was not a Stradivarius label. It was small and brown, handwritten, and Bernard had to tilt the instrument twice before the light fell on it correctly. The ink was faded to the color of weak tea, but it was still legible. He read it once, then he read it again. Then he put the violin very carefully back in its case, closed the lid, reteed the twine exactly as he had found it, and walked to the far end of the room where Matthias was sitting on a metal folding chair, playing something on his phone. "I need you to go wait in the truck," Bernard said. Matthias looked up. "Why?" "Because I don't want you standing next to me when I bid on something." His son looked at him for a moment, then looked at the room full of estate sale furniture and old dishes and brown cardboard boxes. "Is it the violin?" Bernard said nothing. "Okay," Matthias said, and went to find his jacket. There were, as Bernard had counted afterward, 43 people at the auction that morning, and at least a dozen of them were dealers. People who bought and sold antiques and vintage furniture and vintage everything else. People who knew what they were looking at and how to get it cheaply. He recognized two of them. One was a woman named Cécile Arsenault who ran a shop in Orangeville and had once outbid him on a Victorian secretary desk he still thought about. The other was a man he knew only as Whitfield, who had a stall at the Aberfoyle antique market and bought everything and resold most of it online. Neither of them was paying attention to the violin. That was the first thing. He watched both of them move through the room when the viewing period opened, watched where their eyes went, watched what they picked up and put down, and neither of them stopped at the table near the back. Cécile Arsenault spent 4 minutes with a set of sterling silver candlesticks. Whitfield examined a stack of framed prints leaning against the wall. The violin sat in its brown case between the National Geographics and the Confederation plates, and nobody touched it. By the time the auction started, Bernard had made himself look at 7 other things: a pine cupboard, a set of pressed glass, a box of old hardware, so that no one would be able to reconstruct his interest from the pattern of his movements. The auctioneer was a fast-talking man in a green vest who moved through the early lots with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had done this 3,000 times. The pine cupboard went for $400. The pressed glass went in a lot with some other kitchen items for $65. The Confederation plates went for $20 to a woman who seemed genuinely delighted by them. The violin case came up as part of a lot, miscellaneous musical items, which also included a keyboard with a cracked housing, a guitar with 2 strings missing, and a recorder in a plastic bag. "Who'll give me $20 for the lot?" the auctioneer said. Bernard raised his hand. Nobody else raised theirs. Sold for $20. He paid at the table in the corner, carried the lot to his truck, put the violin case carefully on the back seat, and drove home to Collingwood with Matthias, who slept most of the way, and with a feeling in his chest that he did not allow himself to examine too closely until he was back in his shop with the door closed and the label in front of him under a good light. The label said, Johann Georg Thier Geigenmacher, Wien, 1751. Bernard typed the name into his phone and then typed it again because he wasn't sure he'd spelled it correctly the first time. He had. Johann Georg Thier, Viennese violin maker, 18th century, trained in the workshop tradition that had spread north from the Italian masters, one of the most respected craftsmen of his era in the German-speaking world. Bernard found a reference in a German-language auction record, then another in an English-language article from a music journal he couldn't access without a subscription, then a third in a book about historical instrument making that existed as a Google Books preview and cut off after the 3rd page. He sat in his shop for a while. Then he called Augustin Prévost. "I owe you one," Bernard said. Augustin was quiet for a moment. "How much of one?" "I don't know yet. Maybe a significant one. Is it what I thought it might be?" "I don't know what you thought it might be. You said you thought there was a violin." "I thought there might be a violin worth looking at," Augustin said. "My grandfather had a saying. He said, when a man brings something from Vienna on a boat in 1923, he doesn't bring garbage. He brings what he cannot bear to leave behind." Bernard looked at the case on his workbench. "That's a good saying," he said. He did not tell anyone else, not for the first 3 weeks. He took the violin to a luthier in Toronto named Desmarais. Not the instrument itself, but photographs, very detailed photographs taken under good light from every angle, including the interior through the F-holes and a close image of the label. He emailed them without context and asked if Desmarais could give him a preliminary assessment. Desmarais called him 2 days later. "Where did you get this? Estate sale," Bernard said. A pause. "Where is the instrument now?" "Safe." Another pause. "The varnish is consistent with mid-18th century Viennese work. The wood selection and the archiving of the top plate are consistent with the period. The label appears to be original. The ink degradation pattern matches the aging of the instrument. I'm not telling you this is what the label says it is. I'm telling you that nothing I can see in these photographs tells me it isn't. Bernard wrote that down. What would one be worth, he asked, if it were? Desmarais was quiet long enough that Bernard checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. A documented Thier in good condition, Desmarais said finally, would be a significant instrument, significant enough that I would want to examine it in person before I said anything else. They arranged a time for the following week. Bernard drove to Toronto with the violin in its case on the passenger seat belted in, and he did not tell Matthias what he was doing or where he was going because Matthias was 16 and could not be trusted to keep his expression neutral if asked about it at school. Desmarais was a small man in his 60s with the careful hands of someone who had spent his life working on delicate things. He examined the violin for nearly 2 hours while Bernard sat in a wooden chair by the window and tried not to watch too obviously. Desmarais used a loupe, a UV light, a set of measuring calipers, and what appeared to be a very small mirror on a long handle that he used to examine the interior from multiple angles. He played several notes very quietly with the old bow, and Bernard, who knew almost nothing about music, could nonetheless hear that the sound was something unusual, a depth and warmth that seemed to come from the wood itself rather than just the strings. Finally, Desmarais set it down. I'd like to send photographs to a colleague in Vienna, he said. She works with the Kunsthistorisches Museum and has catalogued a number of instruments from this period. Okay, Bernard said. And I would recommend having the instrument examined by Christie's or Bonham's before you do anything else with it. They have specialist departments. Okay, Bernard said again. Desmarais looked at him. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I think I do. Good. Then you also understand that I am not valuing this instrument or making any representation about what it may be worth because I'm not in a position to do that, and neither is anyone who hasn't done the full provenance research. I understand, Bernard said. Where did you say you got it? Estate sale in Brampton. Desmarais looked at the violin for a long moment. Mr. Kowalczyk, he said, I've been doing this for 38 years. I have seen perhaps 4 instruments in my career that made me feel the way this one does. He paused. I'm not saying that to inflate anything. I'm saying it because I think you should know. Bernard drove home from Toronto in the early evening, with the violin on the passenger seat and the sun going orange over the Niagara escarpment, and he pulled over once on a county road between Barrie and Collingwood to sit in the truck for a few minutes with his hands on the steering wheel and think about his father. His father, Leszek Kowalczyk, had come to Canada from Krakow in 1981, during Solidarity, with a trade certificate, a second-hand winter coat, and almost nothing else. He had worked in a factory in Hamilton for 11 years before his back gave out, and then he had learned furniture repair because it was something he could do without bending, and he had taught Bernard everything he knew about looking at old things and seeing what they were. Leszek had died in 2019, 3 months before Matthias was born. Bernard had thought about that a lot over the past several years. The timing of it, the way Matthias had arrived into a house that was still holding its breath after a loss. He sat on the county road until the light was nearly gone, and then he drove the rest of the way home. The Vienna connection took 6 weeks. The colleague Desmarais had mentioned, her name was Dr. Caroline Metzger, and she was a curator of historical instruments at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, responded to the photographs with a measured academic caution that nonetheless contained a sentence Bernard read several times. The characteristics visible in the photographs are consistent with known examples of Thier's work, and if the instrument proves to be genuine, it would represent a significant addition to the documented corpus. She asked if the case had any markings or provenance documentation. Bernard went back to the case. He had examined it before and found nothing, but now he went back to it with more care, removing the silk lining piece by piece. Under the lining at the bottom of the case, pressed flat against the wood, was a folded piece of paper. The paper was fragile enough that he handled it with cotton gloves from his workshop. He unfolded it in sections as slowly as he had ever unfolded anything. It was a bill of sale, in German, dated 1923. He photographed it and sent it to Dr. Metzger. She responded within 24 hours, which Bernard gathered was very fast for her. The bill of sale was from a music dealer in Vienna, made out to a man named Eduard Haas for the purchase of 1 violin attributed to Johann Georg Thier, with a case, a bow, and a certificate of authenticity that was not included in what Bernard had found but which the bill of sale referenced, Eduard Haas. Bernard searched the name and found nothing specific but the surname and the date, 1923, Vienna, a Jewish family name, a man who had taken an instrument on a boat, carried its own weight and its own silence, and Bernard sat with that for a while before he did anything else. Howard Belhaven's maternal great-grandfather, according to the obituary in the Brampton Guardian, had been born in Austria-Hungary and had immigrated to Canada in the 1920s. His surname, before Anglicization, had been Haas. Bernard read the obituary 3 times. Then he went to tell Matthias his son was at the kitchen table doing homework, or at least sitting in front of homework, when Bernard came in from the shop. He sat down across from him and put his phone on the table with the obituary pulled up on screen. "Read the part about his grandfather," Bernard said. Matthias read it. He was quiet for a moment. He looked up. "Is that the guy from—" "Yes." Matthias looked at the phone again. "So the violin came from Vienna in 1923, yes, and there's a bill of sale under the lining of the case." Matthias set the phone down. He was 16 and he had his grandfather's face, the broad cheekbones, the dark eyes, and sometimes when he was thinking hard about something he looked for a moment like Lezek. "Dad," he said, "what does this mean?" Bernard looked at his son for a moment. "It means," he said, "that a man brought something from Vienna on a boat because he couldn't leave it behind. And then it sat in a house in Brampton for about 70 years while everyone around it forgot what it was." Matthias considered this. "And you found it, and I found it for $20 for $20. As part of a lot that also included a broken keyboard." His son was quiet for another moment. Then slowly a grin started at the corner of his mouth. "They're going to lose their minds," Matthias said. Christie sent a specialist from New York in February. Her name was Lucinda Ofosu, and she arrived at Bernard's shop in Collingwood on a Wednesday morning and spent 4 hours with the violin. She had the same careful hands as Desmarais and moved through the examination with a methodical thoroughness that gave nothing away. Bernard made coffee and did not hover. He refinished the leg of a Windsor chair in the corner of the shop and tried to look like a man who was not waiting for anything in particular. At one point Lucinda Ofosu stopped what she was doing and said, without looking up, "How long have you been in this shop?" 22 years, Bernard said. "And your father was in the trade?" "Furniture, not instruments." "But yes." She nodded slightly as if this explained something and went back to what she was doing. When she was finished she sat down in the second chair at Bernard's workbench and set the violin down between them. "I want to be careful about what I tell you," she said, "because provenance research takes time, and I don't want to represent a certainty I don't yet have." "I understand," Bernard said. "But I can tell you that this instrument is consistent in every measurable way with the documented characteristics of Johann Georg Thier's work. The wood species, the cutting angle, the arching profile, the rib dimensions, the varnish composition as far as I can assess it visually, everything is consistent, and the bill of sale you found is, from a preliminary examination, genuinely aged. It's not a recent document." She looked at him directly. "A confirmed Thier violin, well documented, would likely sell at auction in the range of 800,000 to 1.2 million Canadian, depending on condition and the certificate history." Bernard said nothing. "I know that's a large number," Lucinda Ofosu said. "I paid $20, Bernard said. "I know." She almost smiled. "I've been doing this for 19 years, Mr. Kowalczyk. Stories like this happen maybe 3 or 4 times in a career." She paused, sometimes less. The provenance research took 4 more months. Christie's worked with Dr. Metzger in Vienna and with 2 other historical instrument specialists, one in London and one in Montreal. They traced Eduard Haas through immigration records and the records of the Vienna music dealer whose archive had survived the war and was held at a university library in Graz. The certificate of authenticity referenced in the 1923 bill of sale was not found, but the research team located a second document, a repair record from 1908. When the instrument had been brought to a Viennese luthier for new strings and a minor crack repair, that named the instrument explicitly and traced it to a sale from the Thier workshop's own record, which existed in fragmentary form in a Viennese church archive. The fragment showed a violin sold in 1752 to a nobleman whose family had held it for 120 years before selling it to a music dealer, from whom Eduard Haas had purchased it in 1923. A complete chain. Not seamless, but documented enough that Christie's was prepared to stand behind it. Bernard's share of the auction estimate, when Lucinda Ofosu called to walk him through the numbers, was projected at between 900,000 and 1.1 million Canadian net of Christie's commission. He was sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the Collingwood Sobeys when she told him this, because he had pulled over when his phone rang and he hadn't moved since. "Mr. Kowalczyk," she said, "are you still there?" "Yes," he said. "Sorry, yes, I know it's a lot to process. My son is going to university in 2 years," Bernard said. It came out before he decided to say it. Lucinda Ofosu was quiet for a moment. "I see," she said gently. "Then I hope this helps." The auction was held in Toronto at Christie's Canadian Rooms on King Street on a Thursday evening in late October. Bernard brought Matthias. He had not brought him to any of the meetings or the valuation appointments. He'd wanted to keep Matthias away from the uncertainty, from the months of maybe and we believe in pending further research, but the uncertainty was gone now and he wanted his son to be there. They wore jackets, not suits. Bernard did not own a suit. He had a dark gray blazer he'd bought for his sister's wedding in 2015 and he wore that. And Matthias wore a navy jacket he'd borrowed from a friend, and they sat in the fourth row of the auction room among buyers and dealers and phone bidders from 3 continents. And Bernard thought about his father, who had repaired furniture in a Hamilton basement for 11 years, and who had taught him how to look at old wood and see what it was, and who had died without knowing his grandson. The Violin came up as lot 22. The bidding opened at 600,000 and moved in increments of 50,000, and it took less than 4 minutes. It sold for 1.1 million Canadian. A private buyer, through a phone bidder who Christie's later confirmed was a collector of historical instruments from Montreal, who intended to loan the Violin to the Montreal Symphony for occasional performance use. Bernard sat in his chair for a moment after the gavel came down. He felt Matthias put a hand on his shoulder, briefly, the way young men touched their fathers when they didn't have the words yet for what they meant. Outside on King Street afterwards, standing in the cold October air with the city moving around them, Matthias said, "Grandpa would have known, wouldn't he? If he'd seen it in about 30 seconds, Bernard said. 40 maybe. He liked to take his time." They stood there for a while. A streetcar went by, lit up, heading west. "Do you know what the best part is?" Matthias said. "What? 43 people were in that room." Bernard looked at him. "You remembered that? You told me that on the drive home. You said 43 people." "I did." Bernard turned up his jacket collar against the wind. "You know what Augustine's grandfather used to say?" "What?" "When a man brings something from Vienna on a boat," Bernard said, "he doesn't bring garbage. He brings what he cannot bear to leave behind." Matthias thought about that for a moment, and someone found it. 70 years later, Bernard said, in a broken case tied shut with twine. A gust came off the lake, carrying the smell of November. "Come on," Bernard said. "I'll buy you dinner." They walked west on King Street together, the father and the son, in the cold Toronto evening, and behind them the lights of Christie's were still on, and inside, a Violin that had crossed an ocean in 1923 was finally, after everything, exactly where it was meant to be.